So I guess we'll wait just a minute to see who else shows up. All right, well, should we get started? All right, well, hello, everybody. I am Heather Pressman. I am with the Molly Brown House Museum here in Denver, Colorado. I am a white woman in my mid-40s, early 40s, however old I am, and have short hair. And I will pass it on to Sean next.
Well, greetings. I am Sean Blinn. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white male, bald, wearing glasses and a blue shirt in front of a background showing the Jacobus Vanderveer house, which is what I'm going to be speaking about later today. I'll pass that off to Charlotte.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte Martin. I use she, her, and I am the Director of Access Initiatives at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. I am a white woman with light skin, long, dark blonde hair. I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt with a blue fleece over it and a big headset over my ears. And my background is Intrepid's flight deck. So there are some helicopters and airplanes and the Manhattan skyline behind me. I'm very happy to be joining you today, and I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah Thompson, and I am the Special Education and Access Manager at the New York Transit Museum. I use the pronoun she, her, and I am a white woman with brown hair, wearing a black shirt and a headset, and my background is inside a subway car with red seats. And I'll pass it back to Heather.
Awesome. So we are going to be, I kind of flipped through the pictures of our various museums, but we're going to be talking about expanding audiences by expanding accessibility at your site today. So just real quickly, we have a picture here on this slide of the Molly Brown House Museum and what I love to call Sassy Margaret on the right there. And then we have the I can't say it, Sean, you're
Jacobus Vanderveer house.
That one.
Yes.
And the Intrepid, there we go. The lovely back end of the ship. And then one of the fantastic old subway subway cars from the Transit Museum. So before we dive in, we just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping. So if you could put your questions for us in the using the Q&A function, that would be fantastic. And any other chat can obviously go in the chat. And then for those of you who need it, there is live transcription available. So you should see that option somewhere in what you're looking at. So, and I'll pass it over to Sean.
Well, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we gather today to share ideas about how we can be more inclusive, to leverage our work to break down barriers via this digital format, using equipment and high-speed internet that we acknowledge is not available or accessible to many communities. This technology, which for many of us has become central to our daily lives, leaves a significant footprint and contributes to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous people as well as other marginalized groups. Although we are here together virtually, separate by distance in different geographical locations, collectively, we all sit on unceded land that was once occupied by and inhabited by hundreds of native tribes. This is a history that we must acknowledge since it affects our present and will affect our future. We humbly seek to understand our place within this context and encourage everyone to do so as well.
And then Charlotte has some questions for everyone.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Sean. Yes.
You muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Sean. And we would love to get a better sense of who is here in this virtual space with us, because we want to make sure that we are responding to where you are, and you're able to adjust to that. So I put some questions in the chat, but what we'd love to know is who is here? Do we have museums, public historians, libraries, government, people that work in government, or other history practitioners? And what do you do? What is your role in this type of institution? Are you working in education, collections, administration, teaching, or something else? And then where are you on your access journey? Are you asking yourself, access, what's that? You're just getting started, or you're partway down the road, or maybe you're already an access rock star. And so I put those in the chat. I'll put those again, but feel free to respond in the chat. So we'd love to know kind of where you're coming from, and that'll help us as we kind of structure this conversation today. And then, of course, we look forward to answering your questions that you pose in the Q&A as well.
And just if you select host and panelists in the drop down, then everybody will be able to see the chat.
Great. Welcome, Katrina.
Yay, Canada.
And Germany. Okay.
It's the nice thing about doing a virtual conference. It's a little bit easier to
Yes.
come from all over the world. It's a fairly quiet group, I think. All right. Well, while folks are adding those responses, you can see up on the screen, we just have some accessibility facts that we wanted to share with everyone. Now, keep in mind these are particular to the United States. So 26% of all Americans have some form of disability, and most of those are actually not visible disabilities. And a lot of people don't necessarily consider themselves to be disabled when they might technically be. Also, disabilities are often temporary. So, for example, after a woman has a baby, she can get disability because she can't do all of the things that she normally would have. Our federal law obviously prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, which is, the ADA is the most commonly known of those laws that are out there. And the one thing that we wanted to stress, or one of the things that we wanted to stress today, was that, it's not just the people who have disabilities that will determine whether or not they come to visit. It's, if they can't come, then they're likely to not have their friends or family come, which means that it's just, part of it's the law, but it's also good business sense to make sure that you are including people with disabilities in your programs and other things that you're doing at your sites. All right, well, let us dive in. So we came up with sort of one big question that we wanted to talk about today, and we have others as well that will probably come up. But to the panelists, what are the biggest accessibility barriers at your sites, and what have you done to overcome them? So who wants to jump in with that? Sean, you want to go? You look like you're.
I was just about to volunteer, actually. So, yeah, I think that probably the biggest thing that challenge that we've experienced at the Jacobus Vanderveer House is this is, of the four of us here today, this is the oldest of the buildings that exist. It was built in the 1770s, the early 1770s. And it was built, in an era, before accessibility legislation or really before building codes. And so, like every building has its, especially an older building, has its share of quirks, shall we say. And it was really, buildings at that time really not designed for accessibility, certainly wasn't designed as a museum. So the building was acquired. Long story short, a lot of historic preservation work had to be done to make certain that the museum could be accessible. We've made our first floor of 2 floors fully accessible with internal ramps and wide doorways and and a ramp to get in. But the second floor, just due to architectural considerations, is far less accessible than the first. That's one of our. It is a physical challenge, it's an accessibility challenge, and it presents an interpretive challenge for how do we make certain that we focused our interpretation on the first floor, the vast majority of it, but how do we make certain that everybody has full access to as much of the space and the interpretation and exhibits as possible in a building that was not designed for accessibility?
So what are some of the things that you guys have done? I'm a historic house, and so we have many similar challenges in that only the first floor and our basement space have been made accessible for people with mobility devices. So what are some of the things that you've done to open up opportunities for people to use, not use, but see and get access to in some way to that space that is otherwise not accessible?
Well, part of what we're doing is we have a new installation coming in about 2 weeks. And as the installation progresses, one of the things we'll be doing is getting reference photos of everything, like at the moment before we open up, and at least doing something to provide accessibility. And then once we complete the installation of that, we're planning to do videos. We have, during our COVID closures, we did a series of videos. And I can go into how we can do them at very low cost. But it's one of the things we plan to do is just walk people through some of the interactives. And so even if they physically can't get there, to try as best we can on an extraordinarily limited budget. We're a small museum, well within the under $250,000 budget that ASLH says is a small museum, well within that. And so within that limited budget, to try to get the spirit of the interactives and the educational opportunities, and to bring that to as wide an audience as we possibly can. So I don't know if we need to throw this over to if now it's my turn to pick on somebody, but
I'm happy to go next if you like.
I'll pick on Charlotte.
Great. So, similar to Sean's site, this is Charlotte, by the way. Similar to Sean's site, the Intrepid Museum was not built with accessibility in mind. We're based on a former aircraft carrier that served in the U.S. Navy from 1943 until 1974. We also have an early Cold War submarine, a British Airways Concorde, and a space shuttle, as well as a number of aircraft and others. So it's great to see so many aviation museums present today. But when I think about accessibility, I think about the physical access, of course. a lot of our museum is physically accessible, though there are certain areas that we have not been able to make physically accessible. They require stairs or ladders or going through hatches in order to access. But I also think about the barriers around communication and around the sensory environment as well, knowing that there are some really great opportunities presented by our site, as well as many other historic sites, and that we are an immersive environment, right? You have the cavernous space of the hangar deck, for example. You have the flight deck where there are aircraft around you, and you have the environment of being outdoors in New York on the kind of open, it's not really open water, but on the water, which is really immersive and really exciting. The submarine still has that diesel smell as being one of the last diesel powered submarines in the US Navy. But that also presents a lot of challenges, right? Because you have the echoing, the sounds, the way that they reverberate around the hangar deck, and the smells that can really be challenging for certain visitors with or without disabilities. And so I think a lot about some of those challenges, the opportunities, but also the challenges that come alongside that. And then with communication, knowing that, people, we have people who are coming who might not be able to read signage for various reasons, perhaps because of a vision disability or learning disability. And we want to make sure that we're able to get that communication through. So we're not relying just on audio announcements. We're not relying just on visual signage. We're not relying just on our website to convey information, but trying to make sure that we have multiple ways of presenting information, multiple ways of engaging with our content. And that could be through a really highly structured program that we offer, but also by making sure that we have supports in place that folks who just want to visit on their own with their friends or families or their classmates are able to do so as well. And so we want to create this continuum of opportunities and a variety of entry points so that folks can experience that in the way that makes sense for them, suits their goals for coming to the museum, whether those are academic or social emotional or purely fun and recreational, or here to honor the memory of the people who served on the ship, since this is also a memorial to those who lost their lives here, and we want to respect that as well. So knowing that people are coming here for different reasons, we want to make sure that we are removing as many barriers as possible. And when we can't physically remove those barriers or change the environment, that we have the tools available for visitors while they're here or as they're planning their visit, or if they're not able to visit for whatever reason, knowing that they can still access our content through various online portals or through phone and other things as well. And I can go into more of some of those specifics as we go on. But that's really a lot of the way that myself and my team and my great colleagues here really started to think about that. And one tool that's been really important to us is finding collaborators to help us on that journey. So working with our advisors that we have on some of our standing advisory councils, but also more ad hoc ones, working with the New York University NYU Ability Project and their students and their professors to come up with kind of different types of approaches to sensory interpretation and at different cost levels and with different types of materials. So thinking trying to think collaboratively and holistically as well. So yes, and I see a comment in the chat about signage. Yes, so being very thoughtful about font sizes, contrast, there are so many guidelines and also just making sure that we're not just meeting those guidelines, but also that we're trying to surpass the minimum. And that's something that we really think about is not trying to hit a minimum, not trying to hit the basic ADA requirements, but making sure that we are actually trying to surpass those and do so in a meaningful way.
Yeah, like I like to say, the ADA is the starting line, not the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know, so some of the things that we've done at the Molly Brown House Museum to make those inaccessible floors accessible is we have done an interactive video just using a PowerPoint sort of platform and an iPad. So it's really easy. We are bigger budget than, say, Sean's museum, but certainly not huge by any means. So I'm a fan of trying to do whatever we can that is low cost and or free whenever we can. So, you know, we actually had a volunteer who was the one who made that video. So we didn't have to pay for, you know, videography, that kind of thing. He also did the editing and put it into this PowerPoint for us. We also have touch boxes throughout the house that, you know, anyone can use, but we have duplicated a lot of the materials that are in those on the second and third floor, and we have what we call our access lounge. And in that space, people can, that's where they can sit and wait for their rest of their tour group to come, you know, rejoin them. They can watch that video. We have a historic bookcase that has some artifacts in it that are similar to, you know, what you would see elsewhere in the museum. And then we have these touch boxes with pieces of damask fabric that are like what we have up in some of the bedrooms on the walls. We have plaster rosettes from like you would see on the ceilings and things like that. So people can have that tactile experience, whether they're upstairs or downstairs. It's a similar experience. One of the things that we just started doing, thinking about sensory access, is we got some materials that mimic what you would see in the house. So thinking about people who are sensory seeking, you know, if they see a Victorian hat with all these beautiful feathers on it, you know, of course you're going to want to touch it. So we have feathers, and we have velvet hair scrunchies, you know, and satin hair scrunchies that were cheap to get, and you know, they mimic the feel of what people are naturally wanting to try to touch. So you know, we didn't have to spend thousands of dollars getting replica materials or anything like that. We literally ordered them from Amazon for like $10. So there's lots of different options.
I'll say I love a low cost replica or analogous object. We use little portable foam fans for propellers all the time.
Nice. Sarah, tell us about your site.
Yes, this is Sarah again. So the New York Transit Museum is located in downtown Brooklyn, New York, in a decommissioned subway station, which was built in 1936. So similar to everyone else, accessibility was not a consideration at that time. So of course, physical access has been a big barrier for us, and still continues to be, because we're not able to put in an elevator, and even our entrance, to walk inside, you immediately walk downstairs from the sidewalk, if you're familiar with a typical New York City subway entrance. So we have at the back of our museum a separate entrance, which is not an ideal way to do things, to have a separate entrance, but that's what we have to work with. And that has a lift then that goes down 3 flights of stairs, actually. So it's quite an undertaking, and that needs a lot of maintenance, but it is how we make our space accessible. And then we have a second lift that will go from our mezzanine level down to our platform level, where those vintage subway and train cars are parked along our platform. Also, our space being in a subway station, it's all concrete. Our lighting is not sensory friendly, and it's, you know, not, our whole space isn't climate controlled. So there's a lot of barriers there as well. And so we're aware of that. Also, our, you know, the air and ventilation system makes a lot of noise. I'm hearing the air in my office here right now, and slightly distracting me. So I talked to our staff about, like, if they're doing an educational workshop, like, to be aware that there's a lot of sensory input here from the sounds and the lighting. So what can we do in other ways to reduce that sensory input, such as making sure our counters are decluttered, that there's not a lot of visuals to distract us around. So we look at it from that perspective as far as programming. And of course, like others, we have resources available to the general visitors, social narratives and noise reducing headphones and what have you. And it's been a big step that we're bringing more of my voice from the access perspective into exhibit design, which is really exciting for us. We're also a very tactile museum, which is wonderful. It's still a subway station, and that's the immersive environment. And so it's really special for me is that we're able to welcome groups with disabilities to practice subway riding skills and the social etiquette about riding the subway. So it's these really great, unique opportunities. And for a lot of people, they just love transit so much, and we're so happy that we're able to foster that and make it a strength for them when other times maybe it's seen as a negative that they're so focused on transit. And so that's kind of the gist of where we are and our access journey as well.
Awesome. So I guess one of the other things that we had talked about when we were planning this session was meaningfully engaging self-advocates in the work that we're doing. So can you guys talk a little bit about how you're doing that at your sites? Whoever wants to jump in.
I'm happy to go ahead unless someone else wants to go first. So we have a few different ways of engaging folks, both with a couple of standing advisory councils, and then also with bringing folks in for specific prototyping and feedback. So we, for example, have had for a number of years, even before I started here, and I've been here for a while, I've been at the museum for over 8 years now, we've had a standing autism advisory council. And this advisory council initially was parents of children with autism and some professionals. But pretty soon after I came on, we made the decision to expand it to include adult self-advocates as well, because we recognize that the experience, the input of parents is incredibly valuable. They're the ones bringing their children to the programs. But we also wanted to make sure that we were getting the input of people with that lived experience. We also wanted to make sure that we were inclusive, not just of children, but also adults with autism and neurodiverse adults. And so bringing that voice in has been incredibly valuable for us. This is a group that meets quarterly, and we were meeting in person at the museum. We switched to meeting virtually, and that's kind of at the beginning of each year. We kind of check in and assess what people want to do, if they'd rather meet in person or virtually. And it's really helpful. They've helped guide a lot of our sensory friendly programming, including our early morning openings for kids with autism and their families, as well as our sensory friendly evenings for teens and adults. And then also some of our other group programs. They have also given us incredible feedback on making public programs more welcoming, and just the general museum. They've given us feedback on exhibits, elements that we've prototyped, our social narrative that we have on our website, and for individual programs, our sensory guide. And when we developed our mobile guide during the pandemic, some of them volunteered to be user testers for that, kind of as we were developing that, which was really valuable. And so that's been really great to have, in order to make sure that we are welcoming. We think a lot about the way we structure meetings, making sure we have agendas ahead of time, adding kind of visual cues to those agendas. When we were recruiting people this time, we included a kind of breakdown of one pager of what to expect from these meetings, and kind of set those expectations clearly, and make sure that we have different ways that people can communicate and share. But we also have a veteran advisory council, which has been really valuable for us. But then also when we are developing new exhibits or new kind of digital components, we do bring in other self-advocates with disabilities. So as part of this project that we've been doing, funded by IMLS, to develop sensory tools for interpreting historic sites, when we had our prototype exhibit, we were able to bring in visitors who are blind, visitors with various developmental or intellectual disabilities, and people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And that was really valuable just to get that direct input from them. We also had advisors who were paid advisors throughout the development process of those. So we had historic sites from across the country, but we also had these disability advocates who were advising. So they were kind of helping advise throughout, and then we were able to bring in people who weren't so embedded in the project to then give kind of their fresh input on those prototypes. And so that's something that's been really helpful. And so something I definitely recommend, whether it's something you do have standing or something where you bring people in for specific projects. It's really helpful and helps really get that buy-in as well. And it's just something I would say is just making sure that you're recognizing the effort that takes and recognizing that expertise. So depending on the amount of commitment that it requires, thinking about an honorarium or stipend or a membership or some other sort of recognition for the amount of time and effort that they're putting into sharing their expertise. So incredibly valuable, but just wanting to be really thoughtful and then actually following through on those suggestions and that feedback so that people know that you actually are taking them seriously and not just doing it for show. And I will say that as we're developing a new website, that is something that we're working on. We are bringing in some consultants to help us with user expertise testing, specifically around accessibility as we do that.
That's fantastic, Charlotte.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, thinking about compensation and thinking about different ways that you can compensate these groups. Like Charlotte mentioned, you can do a membership, at the very least, feed them lunch while you're, dinner, whatever it is, whenever you're meeting, just as a way to say thank you, or, it could even be gift cards or gifts from your museum store or something like that, just as a way to say, we recognize your time is valuable and thank you for doing this and helping us become a better site. Sarah, you guys also have an access group, right?
We do not have an advisory committee like Charlotte described, but well, for a couple of things, a couple of examples, like Charlotte said about the website, we're right now in the middle of getting quotes for a website access audit. And it's very important to us as we're looking at different companies to do that they are testing with users with disabilities. When I was developing a Braille and tactile guidebook at the museum, I brought that to a Braille study group to give me feedback on it as well. So like Charlotte was saying, like when you're developing something, make sure you're able to test it by the actual users. And kind of a departure from this, but I think is also really important is representation on your staff matters as well. And so for us, our part-time education staff, we have two self-identified neurodivergent employees who they have the same job title as our other part-time education staff. They're doing the same work out on the floor. And also when I'm doing an access program, it's always great when they're also able to work it as well. It's really important. And we're also in the process, I made the outreach, the connections so that our retail department is also now working with a organization that does customized employment for neurodivergent individuals, so that they're now going to be a part of our workforce as well. And I think that's also really important to our staff in general, to have those interactions with people with disabilities on your staff, because it really helps with the awareness and then who we're welcoming into our space as well.
And coming from a small museum, a very small museum, is our main constraint is we also don't have an advisory group, and part of the reason is simply it's the staff time is simply not. It's such a challenge to get resources okay, I can put a period after that and after the word resources, and it's still a true statement. It's a challenge to get resources. But what we try to do is consider that as our county government, our county's Cultural and Heritage Commission has a lot of connections, and they're getting increasingly active in offering workshops. We are not the smallest museum in the area by far, even though we're pretty small. And so the county offers workshops for very small and museums with no paid staff, all volunteer-run institutions, about topics like accessibility, among other things, and that those are a good resource where you can at least make connections in the community and find other people who are thinking about the same topics. And so it's not us working alone. It is working with peers, and just to know that it's helpful to know that help is available. And so I would just encourage everybody to reach out to your local governments, especially because they can often have amazing resources that are designed to help organizations like all of ours, especially the smaller ones that where resource constraints are a very real thing. Resource constraints, time constraints, expertise constraints, that these are things that can definitely be done. And again, from a low budget perspective, Charlotte, you had mentioned in particular designing the audio guides, designing websites, and just one exercise that I went through when I was in graduate school was test the website. You to do some testing at home or on your own is turn on the accessibility features on whichever device you're using, whether it is your laptop, tablet, a phone. Turn on the accessibility features and close your eyes and try to navigate your own website. And it is really quite interesting to see how many assumptions we make. So that is literally a zero cost option that I found just incredibly helpful, both in terms of finding areas where it's not accessible, and just being increasing your own awareness, your coworkers' awareness about the need for accessibility, and just how many assumptions are that we're not even aware of that are built into our own websites and other technology projects.
Well, that leads perfectly into what I wanted to sort of talk about next, which is, many of us here are from small organizations, and have gotten smaller since the pandemic. So how can we build thinking about accessibility in every aspect of our operations? And how can we sort of overcome some of those objections that we might be facing from people who just don't quite get why we need to be doing this work? I know that's a big question.
I'm happy to start again, but also happy to let someone else start if one of you would prefer. Okay.
Well, I just, so it's not just you starting, but I think that the idea that we mentioned earlier is about the business development, the audience development share of this is these things can be really important, is saying, okay, it's not just for first of all, it's not a small group of people. And I think that statistic right there is absolutely essential for people to say, it's like, wait a minute. And yeah, so just to start with that, it's, that's important. But then to point out, I mean, this is just to say, okay, to share the information that you will lose not just a visitor, you will lose groups of visitors. And I know we've said that before, but it's important enough to repeat that it's a good way to overcome objections, is to say, okay, if you have X dollars as your financial target and you are starting with, you're taking out 0.26x of your audience share, then you're gonna, it's boom, gets the point across, and you get your development committee on board as an ally pretty quickly.
And I'll build off that to say it, it is about tailoring that message. If you're thinking about, the pure kind of income aspect, yeah, like the fact that you have a large portion of the population with disabilities, they also have money that they want to spend. They need, they're going to go somewhere. So why not make it your place? But then also thinking about, when I think about within the education department, when I first started here, the access team for our kind of programs for self-contained classes, we were the only educators who brought like touch objects with us, who brought supplemental photos with us or visual vocabularies with us. But as we started doing training and making clear that idea that you don't know who's going to be on your program, we'll ask the schools, the teachers to give us information ahead of time, but they're busy. They have a lot going on. They're usually not giving us, a play-by-play of each student in their class. So you don't know who's going to be in your program. So just being prepared for any student, and knowing that, our goal here is to make it so that everybody has that opportunity to learn, to achieve those learning goals that we set. And it's our responsibility to make sure that as many students as possible can have that opportunity. And it makes it more fun for us. It's fun, it's engaging, it's being able to communicate in different ways, but thinking back to how you learn when in all the different ways you learn and bringing that. And it makes you a stronger educator overall, whether or not you have students with disabilities, students with IEPs on your program. And so that's kind of how we built that case a little bit, is people also just seeing the results of that, of kind of experiencing that, seeing how engaged the students are, seeing that they're, suddenly able to reach students that they thought, just weren't paying attention, but maybe it was because they, just show that they're focusing differently, or maybe they need something to handle in order to be able to focus that attention, get that energy out of the way. Making sure that everyone knows that fidgets and noise reduction headphones and the like are available to them. Whereas, with our exhibits team, it's making the case for like, wow, you constructed this beautiful exhibit and you have all this amazing information, but is everyone actually able to access this? Is everyone actually getting this? Like, are you leaving people out? And don't you want to be able to engage everyone, or engage more people? And that's been really exciting to see. And by bringing in some folks to do some prototyping and experiment with that, it's really, I think, invigorated our exhibits team. We do have in-house fabricators, and it's created challenges for them that they really find exciting and enjoy being able to figure out, and it's made their work more interesting. So I think kind of posing that in different ways, like with our visitor services team, focusing like, our role is customer service, right? It's making people feel welcome. And, accessible customer service is good customer service. It's also finding those not hidden, but like the advocates you didn't know about within your department. So giving people the chance to share their experience, share what they know. And that's something I do a lot in trainings, is really making clear that I invite people to share their experience if they're comfortable doing so. To share what they've done, success stories that they've had, that feeling they had when they, were able to make a visitor feel really welcome or address a challenge that someone was finding within our space. And having those stories, having those anecdotes available. And then again, bringing in folks with lived experience to share those stories. Someone might try something out, they might try out the accessibility features on their phone, but hearing from someone directly who uses that's going to make that big difference. And so going through that, we also go through a lot of scenarios, like with our security team, we run through scenarios and just feeling that they're more equipped to handle situations that are maybe unexpected for them, has made a big difference as well. So, I think the starting point for many people is like the fear of a lawsuit, which is a powerful thing, but that's a starting point. That's not a real motivation. So I think really getting into that, and playing on the fact that like we are professionals, and we can do a better job. We can do, we can do a better job and actually respond. Make our amazing historic resources more available. Who doesn't want that? And make sure that we're actually serving our visitors and our staff and our volunteers better. Because like Sarah mentioned, you don't know who on your staff, who on your team, or people who would like to be on your team might have a disability and want to make sure that they are included in that as well.
One thing that we've done at the Molly Brown House Museum is we have created what we call DEIA ambassadors. And so on every committee, whether it's board or staff or, however it's structured, we have one of those ambassadors sitting on one of those committees so that we're always thinking about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, so if we're planning a program, like, okay, well, that's great, but, is it going to be accessible? Are we talking about a diverse enough group of people? Those sorts of things as we're moving towards getting more people on staff to think about it. And I had a proud moment the other day when we were installing an exhibit. The curator was putting some labels on, and somebody suggested, oh, well, what if we put it up here versus, where she was talking about putting it, and she was like, well, then it won't be, it won't be legible if somebody's in a wheelchair. They won't be able to view it. And I was like, yes, my work here is done. Not really, though. So that was just, one moment where it was nice to see that I wasn't having to be the person to jump in and say, hey, you need to be thinking about this.
And just one thing that to incorporate accessibility, well, I know that we've touched on touch objects and tactile learning. And one of the things that we've done is, again, we get lots of feathers, but since we interpret the one part of the American Revolution, we have, life-size replicas of the Declaration of Independence. And for some of our events, we set up an inkwell, and we have the opportunity for children to sign the Declaration of Independence with a quill pen. And this is, again, extraordinarily low budget. Thankfully, nobody spilled the ink yet. I hope I just didn't jinx myself. But we let people come in, and yeah, the kids get to sign the Declaration of Independence with the quill pen. They're invariably better at it than the adults are. But it's a great chance to, reach. It incorporates tactile learning with reinforcing the history. And it's also a nice, the parents love getting the photos of their kids signing the Declaration of Independence. It's terrific. It brings everything together, and it costs us, very little, a few feathers, and a few dollars for a large scale reproduction of the Declaration of Independence. We got a whole bunch of them up in the office, and we just bring one out and people sign away. But it brings everything together for that tactile experience. Maybe I need more coffee, and also reinforcing the history.
This is Sarah again. And, I think for overcoming objections, it's really, you wear people down after you keep saying the same thing. And it takes a long time. I've had the same conversations over and over, and it gets exhausting, and I want to give up. I'm like, I'm not going to do this anymore. But you do eventually get to the point when people start coming to you, and they're on your side and they're speaking up for you in their own meetings. It gets to that point. So be optimistic about it. Don't give up. I think another issue, a barrier that I have as well, and I'm sure other museums do too, is, right, you're saying, well, we need to provide captioning for this event or ASL interpretation, and people respond, your coworkers respond with, but we're not getting requests for that, that's not a part of our audience. And, it's like, well, they're not a part of our audience because we're not providing them anything as well. And so That's a really tough thing that you have to work around on your staff. But just, again, it's just something that you have to work toward, and little by little you get there.
I like that. Just wear them down. It works. But yeah, it's it is really wonderful when you do start to see those small changes, and other people starting to say, hey, what about this? Because in most places, most of us are the only person doing the work or thinking about the work, and those of us in the access world recognize that, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. One of the things that we talked about when we were planning this is, just start small, do something. Doing something is better than doing nothing. So even if it's just something as simple as, putting out a quill pin for people to be able to use, it doesn't cost a ton of money, versus, all the way up to if you have lots of money and you're redesigning your website, and hopefully you can make it totally accessible and cool. Everything in between. So.
Yeah, I'll just quickly second Sarah's, just do it over and over again. So I second that, and I'll say it's changed a lot over the 8 years that I've been here. And it's interesting nowadays how much our VPs love to talk about all the accessibility that we have, and bring it out to funders and stuff. And that's a big change, but it's because that recognition takes time, but it's worthwhile. And so I'll just say that.
I will also say, in addition to just swearing them down, also have friendly conversations where you're just talking about things and people are like, that's a really good point. And then they start remembering that as well, and appreciate your perspective and ask you to be a part of their meeting too. There's different ways to do it for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've talked about too is trying to get on board with when things are starting, like when projects are starting. If you can be at the table early on, it makes the work so much easier for everybody in the end. But yeah, like you just said, Sarah, have those friendly conversations. But again, I think a lot of people think, oh, access, it's going to be expensive, like I need to make all these huge physical changes to the structure and site. It's like, well, no, you don't. There are lots of other things you can do. And again, just stressing that there's a ton of cheap and inexpensive options, even free options out there that you can utilize to help get the work started. And again, doing something is better than doing nothing. So yeah.
Heather, to your point about being in the conversation early, before I joined the museum field, I was working in the corporate sector, and one project where I was a very junior member of the project team, but nobody had informed the accessibility office that they should be involved, and so they came in late, and it was a huge, enormous, really deeply unpleasant meeting when it's like people, when they were finally found out that the project had been going on, and said, well, these are the things that should be done. And the people leading the project it was one of the most shocking and disturbing examples of overt hostility, and just that I have ever seen in a professional environment. And so it's unfortunate, but it happens. And I mean, yeah, I agree with Sarah. Sometimes it can feel like, oh God, this is where we are the ones who are getting ground down. But it's why it's important to think about these things up front, because at that point, you can think about accessibility early on. It costs a lot less, and it's easier to make the sale for it as this is audience development. This is not a checkbox. This isn't a legal requirement. This is not a threat of a lawsuit. This is the way that we, to go back to the theme that we've all said before, this is audience development. This is how you reach people. This is how you bring more people in. It's mission, it's finance, it's physical plant. It really is all encompassing. And the earlier you think about it, then the more it is it's easier to get people on board. And it is much easier to really show people the fact that this is a positive thing that benefits everybody, and that it's not just, we got to go through the checklist again and suffer through it. It's, think about it early, think about it at the start of a project. Absolutely.
I'll just agree. It is always more cost effective and less work to do it from the beginning, to engage in that conversation at the very beginning. And that's something that has changed a lot over time here, is kind of where access comes into play when we're doing new exhibition development, for example, or public program planning, and things like that. So absolutely agree with that. And I'd say even earlier, if you are putting together a funding request, whether it's for a grant or an individual donor or anything like that, building those costs into your budget, commits the institution to that, because you put it in the grant that you're going to provide captioning, but it also helps ensure that you have that funding there. And I think there is also more recognition among funders about the importance of that. And so making that case in those funds, even if it's not an access specific grant, maybe you're getting a grant for an event, for a big anniversary celebration that's coming up across the country, or for an exhibit, but actually trying to build that into those proposals has been something that's been really helpful for us as well, in helping us sustain that support and sustain the budgets for some of these accessibility considerations as well.
And I would add to that too, that, when you are in budgeting cycles, whatever you happen to be, whatever your budget cycle is, that you try to get other departments to include access to, because, like, for example, we don't have an accessibility line at our museum. So I just put stuff into my education budget, but I'm like, well, why should I have to pay for the interpreters? That's really more visitor services. So, here you go, visitor services, put this in your budget. Or, we need a new iPad for the access lounge, like that should be in our IT budget, so the more you can spread it out, the less sort of sticker shock it is usually for the people reviewing your budgets. So spread it out if you can. Share the wealth. Well, awesome. The only other thing that I wanted to touch on real quickly, we have a few more minutes before we're going to open it up for Q&A. Oh, Sarah, did you want to say something?
I just had one more inexpensive thing to add. I would love to develop a verbal description program for our visitors who are blind. That's an endeavor to develop a whole new program, and that's going to cost money. And we know we want to hire the good consultants for this, and as we're piloting, be able to provide maybe an honorarium, what have you, right? Costs money. But so what we do for our visitors who are blind is they can just request an hour-long tour when they visit the museum. And so, great, I can do that quick. That's not going to be a big strain on me, certainly not financially. And so it doesn't have to be strict a verbal description tour. That's not what we're saying, but just to be able to orient somebody to the space, to be able to tell them what things are, right? Because they're not going to be able to read your labels. So just, it's not something that we just do at the drop of the hat. It has to be requested in advance. But I feel like that's just another thing that, you're able to do without it being a financial strain for you.
Yeah, it's sometimes just thinking outside the box a little bit, right? What can we do with what we have? to make it more accessible in some way. So yeah, so that sort of leads to what I was actually gonna bring up next is, a lot of people think that access, or when they think about access, they think, oh, physical access. And we've all touched on a little bit about how our sites are physically inaccessible in some way or other, because we're all historic sites. And some of us are underground and some of us are floating in the water. So we are all unique in our own ways. So just, what are ways that you guys have gotten people at your sites to sort of think about the concept of accessibility beyond just physical access?
Well, one thing that I can speak to, something that I want to bring up is it's not so much the physical thinking beyond it, but thinking in terms of being sensory friendly to people who might be sensitive to noises. We are a Revolutionary War museum. It's like the Intrepid, it's got a military history side to it, a very large military history side to it. In particular, we interpret part of the artillery division in the Revolutionary War. We have cannons firing on the lawn a few times a year. And to anybody who's ever been around cannon fire, it is loud. It is a huge draw. It's a crowd pleaser for most people. There's a flash of light. There's a huge bang. And we have 2 cannon firings at the top of every hour during some of our events. And but in terms of thinking about being sensory friendly, it's like it's not necessarily going to be a happy experience for everybody. And people may be people who need a sensory friendly environment. We don't have the early hours, the evening hours for a sensory friendly environment, but when we are having when we don't have the cannon fire, it becomes much less of an issue. When we do have the cannon fire, it's just thinking, and it's realizing that that what benefits one group of people could also have benefits in terms of accessibility, that you simply have a published schedule, and people who say, well, when it's the cannon fire, I don't want to miss it, have the published schedule of your daily events and say, okay, it's going to be at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. And so the people who don't want to miss it can go outside and see the cannons firing on the lawn and come back in. And for people, parents with children who are for whom this could be deeply disturbing, it's like, okay, we're going to have cannon fire, and you might want to move to a quieter location. You might want to go back to your car for a few minutes. And it's just, it is, again, as we've been saying it all through this presentation, is thinking creatively and thinking outside the box and trying to do these things to consider everybody's needs. That's how we do it. It literally costs nothing to have somebody run through the museum and say, by the way, there's going to be cannon fire in 10 minutes, and people can go to the location where they feel the most comfortable. But it took us a little while to figure that out when we started doing the cannon fire. But it literally costs us nothing.
I'll just note that as the kamikaze experience is going off right below my office right now, I relate to that and appreciate that you have been, making that effort to warn people about that coming. So yes, definitely
I was thinking about
that.
your experience.
Yep, it's happening right now. It's every hour on the half hour at our museum. So definitely relate to that. So I don't need to repeat what you said there, but I'll just say, like, we think a lot about, besides the sensory stuff, besides the some of that stuff, we think a lot about the communication too. And part of it, the way that we were able to make the case for some of that is that people have, had experience that, like trying to respond to a visitor, trying to engage with someone and realizing they don't necessarily have the tools or aren't sure of the approach or not sure of the reason that they're having a miscommunication. And so by kind of going through these scenarios and inviting people to share their questions ahead of time so we can prepare responses, and inviting that when we're doing training has been really meaningful and really helpful, because I'm not on, I am on the floor quite a bit, but I'm not there all the time. I'm not engaging with visitors the same way that some other staff are, the way our security staff or our visitor services staff are. And so hearing directly from them and then being able to position, okay, what are some possible reasons that maybe they didn't respond the way that you expected? And kind of getting into that and really empowering them as professionals to have a better sense of the possibilities and have a better sense of ways that they can respond or adjust their approach. So I think that's one thing that's been really helpful as well.
At the Transit Museum, as I said, when I started here in 2017, we had pretty robust programming for our visitors with autism or developmental disabilities. Like, the museum was like, that's our audience. And yeah, so that's not something I really have to talk too much about with our staff, because we've all heard it a lot. We know that that's a part of our audience. For me, it's more, bringing in new ideas, updating on, because things are in accessibility is always evolving. So we're very aware of it, but for me, it's bringing in those updates, the reminders. More of the challenge for me is for visitors who are blind or visitors who are deaf. Something definitely that my supervisor also, like, she came on a year after me and also recognized, like, why are we so focused on this one area of accessibility? So that's something that we've been ongoing working towards. And certainly, I'll give one example. Of course, I do all staff trainings and workshops. And so last summer, and great, I did it on Zoom. So we recorded it. And then as we're onboarding new staff, we share that recording. And it was so wonderful. Soon after one of our new staff watched it, we had visitors who were blind. And one of them asked our staff member to guide him to our restrooms. And he's like, Sarah, it was great because I just had watched your recording and you explained how to guide somebody who's blind. So just a small thing, like explaining how to interact with a visitor like that, was huge.
Yeah, we had an instance in the fall where we had some visitors come who were deaf, and in the past, pre-pandemic, we only had guided tours, and so we would have to get an ASL interpreter. But with the pandemic, we had moved to self-guided. We had just QR codes. You pulled it up on your phone. But the challenge was trying to communicate with how to purchase tickets and where to go once you got your tickets, and like all of those pieces of information. And so I made sure that our visitor services staff now have a whiteboard that they can use behind the counter in case they do have somebody who comes up and needs it. The other thing we did was I had one of our staff literally just her whole spiel, like verbatim, typed up, here's where to go after you get your ticket. Here's the restroom code. Here's how to pull up the self-guided tour. Like all of that information that we were verbally giving people, it's like, we can print it out in large print and hand it to people. And it was, it just took that one person coming in and being like, there was this huge challenge, communication challenge that we weren't prepared for, and the solutions were so simple. And it was great because after that, we have had some more visitors who are deaf or hard of hearing come in, and they've been able to utilize those tools. Well, if you guys don't have anything else to add, we are at about time we wanted to be able to open it up to Q&A. And there's a few questions in the Q&A for us, so feel free to add some more in there as we're answering these. but let's start. Let's start with the second one that's in here. So how can we remove financial barriers for visitors? And I'm happy to start with that one. So in Denver, we have something called the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, which is a specialized tax district that was, I don't even remember when, 70s, maybe 80s, was established. So we offer free days as part of that. But beyond that sort of special, very hyper local thing that we have, we're also part of Museums for America, which you can provide reduced admission. We are partners with almost all the different libraries in our area to offer free passes. That way, trying to think of what else we do. We have, a couple different things like that that we're doing that involve partnerships as well. So, Sean, it looks like you wanted to chime in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I know that you mentioned Museums for America, and another program that generally runs over the summers is Blue Star Museums. It's a program that allows free admission for active duty members of the U.S. military and their families, generally running during the summer months. I think the sign-up period is closed. It's one of the NEA or the NEH who administers that. But if you search for Blue Star Museums, that is another terrific program that basically says, for a group of people, especially for a museum as we are with a military history connection, it's a nice way to say thank you to the the people who have also Museums for All. I see Charlotte added that in the chat. One thing that we've been able to do specifically for tour groups, for school groups, I should say, is we've been able to get grant funding from private foundations. And we've been super lucky that they pay for educational programming, including transportation. And this is all back during the pre-pandemic years. I know we haven't had any school groups coming since COVID started. Not sure if we're going to be able to have anything this year, although I'm hoping so. But the terms of the grant were that we could, they would cover transportation, which is a huge financial barrier. That the schools, they have the desire, they've got the interest, the teachers want to do it, the administration wants to do it, and nobody can pay for it because field trips are one of the first things that gets cut when the budget gets slashed. And thankfully, we've been able to keep our school group tours going because of this private grant foundation that has that said, we just throw open the registration, and the first however many schools that we're able to take for that particular day, the first 6, 7, 8 who sign up get the slots. And it's like, no, you really don't have to pay for it. And yeah, I know it can take some work to go after private funding, just to research it and then to apply for it. But that has been just absolutely enormous for us. Is that private funding. If we can, it's the main barrier, that financial accessibility, that keeps so many school groups, even our local school, which is a mile away maybe, but it's that funding that allows people to come over. So I would say definitely take a look, see for private grant foundations, and see if they're able to help you out with paying for transportation costs.
I'll second that. The transportation aspect for our programming for individuals with dementia and their care partners, when we were invited to apply for a grant from the Mellon Foundation, we actually included transportation to and from the museum for participants as part of that. Because we know that it can be really challenging for people to get here, especially even with public transportation is challenging, but especially if you're not comfortable or able to use public transportation, it's incredibly really challenging to get here. And so that was something that we worked into that and are happy to be able to arrange for those program attendees. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, Sean. And the other thing I'll note is that for our access programs, we do, in our requests for funding, we do work in that these programs are pretty much all of them are free, because we recognize that it can be more expensive living with a disability. You have additional services that you might need to pay for, or other kind of considerations that cost more. And also knowing that you may not be certain of how long you can actually stay for a program if it's your first time attending, for example. And so we want to make it kind of a low commitment in order to be able to participate. And then I'll say we also participate in the Museums for All program. We were the first museum in New York City to participate. So, but one of the ways that we our leadership kind of made the case themselves, convinced themselves, is that knowing that all you're doing is bringing in people who wouldn't come otherwise. You're growing your audience. It's not cutting into the people who are buying tickets. And for Museums for All, just in case you're not familiar, basically if you have an EBT card, at our museum, you can bring it up to 4 people. Other museums have different parameters for that. But all it is, it's bringing in people who wouldn't come otherwise. It's opening things wider. And people then might buy lunch when they're here or buy something at the gift shop. But it's also growing that kind of that community. We are, we're private nonprofit, independent nonprofit, but we are also a public institution. We get that nonprofit status because we are contributing to our community, and so that's part of that as well. And that is a case that we do have to actively make to funders, and it's work. And it's one of those things that's unfortunate where, like, in order to get more funding, you need to have the people to get that. But the way that you can afford the people to get that is by having more funding. So it's kind of this cycle. But that is something that we really value as well, is trying to make things more financially accessible. There's also in New York City, there's the Culture Pass program, which is through the library systems, where you can kind of check out passes to museums and things like that. We also we just brought back our free Fridays. So, trying different ways. I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't charge admission at all. In New York City, the calculus is a little different than in a lot of other places in terms of the extent to which admission actually covers costs. But it's, we try in other ways, but I'm glad that the person asked that, because it is a big consideration.
Yeah, this is Sarah, and I agree. I'm glad the person asked this question. I had it actually in my notes that cost was a barrier as well. At the Transit Museum, we do have discounted rates for adults who identify as having a disability, both for general admission and for membership. And for, we do limit how many people in a group can get that discount, because we also discount that for our groups, both when we had our programs here at the museum and when we are now doing virtual schooling group programs. Those rates are discounted, and really that's an incentive because we want people to identify their group as being an access group, so that we make sure that we're providing the support so that they have the best experience possible. We also offer for general admission and for our membership, personal care attendant complimentary passes as well. So for an adult with a disability who wouldn't be able to visit or participate on their own, they're able to have that complimentary pass for their personal care attendant, whoever that may be. And we also will sometimes work that into for our school program if they just have a lot of additional staff because their students need that support. We'll also provide some of those for them as well.
I'll note we also do free admission for personal care attendants, and that there actually, I just go back, there have been lawsuits about this at museums. So that's going back to that. That's kind of what brought it to a lot of museums' attention. Unfortunately, that's what it took. But yeah, we do that as well, and I think that's super important. And similarly with when we have school groups or day habs or others that come, we don't have a cap on chaperones or staff the way we do with other school groups, where we then start charging. We don't charge if they're up to 1-to-1, because we want to make sure that people have the support they need, whether they're kids or adults, whatever the reason for that support. You want to make sure that they're not going to lose that because it costs extra to be able to have that. So that is, I'm glad that you brought that up, Sarah.
All right, I've got a couple more questions that have popped in here. So the first one says, as the result of the pandemic and a need to reach audiences across a very, very large area, we're now delivering most of our educational programs virtually. With a team of one, a one-shot instruction, context, and an ocular-centric collection and format, there are a lot of inherent barriers to accessibility. What suggestions do you have for making virtual programming as inclusive as possible? It's a lot of words in one question.
I just want to say I love the word ocular centric. I had not run into that before. Thank you for adding that to my vocabulary, whichever anonymous attendee. Thank you. That's an awesome word.
I can talk a little bit. I think it depends a little on your audience, but things like making sure that you're including on a baseline that you have the captioning turned on in whatever interface you're using. But we think about ways of engaging people beyond visuals. So for example, I started doing virtual verbal description tours during the pandemic that I've continued doing on a quarterly basis. And those are free and open to the public. And one of the challenges that we have been offering verbal description touch tours on site for a long time, but we lose that touch aspect, right, when we're doing it virtually. But I've seen it also as an opportunity to actually include other senses that we have a harder time doing. So including things like oral histories within that, or including music or other sounds that are actually really hard to do when we're at the museum because it's so vast and echoey and everything. So thinking of those other senses that we can engage, actually being able to include some of those oral histories, for example. And then in a lot of our other programs, we include a lot of movement. We invite different ways of engaging. We acknowledge that not everyone might be comfortable or able to participate verbally or want to unmute. So we invite writing in the chat, talking with the person next to you. We invite people to turn their camera on to do movements or other things. We include a lot of movement in our programs, depending on the age, of course, and who the audience is. But we think about movements we can include. We think about sound effects that we can include, and and also, knowing that people are in their space, but are there ways that they can engage the environment that they're in related to the content of the program? Are there things that we're showing that maybe have resonance with things that they might have in their classroom or their home or wherever they might be? That we can encourage them to reach out to and relate to. For some of our programs, we create kind of activity packets that we send out ahead of time. These are digital that they can do before or after and refer to during the program. And that's something that's really helpful. But yeah, just thinking about, like I said, movements, we will incorporate sign language for some of the terms that we use as a different way of introducing vocabulary, which has been really helpful. And yeah, so just thinking about that, on the ship, for example, because it was so loud, because on the flight deck, you had aircraft taking off, they used a lot of hand signals and other things to communicate. So bringing some of that into the programs and just giving people a different way of engaging with the content beyond just the visual on the screen.
This is Sarah. I'll add in, for my programs, I was always, of course, providing social narratives, but now also for our general family virtual programs, we make sure we have a social narrative for that specific program as well. And part of our workflow for that is also that I go through and make sure everything is tagged for accessibility so that somebody using a screen reader can also use that. So you need to build that into your process too. Easy to forget. And then for like our adult public program virtual digital discussions, we call them, from the beginning, like I was on all of those run throughs and giving the feedback of how to make this more inclusive. And generally that's like, describe your images to me. You have to say something about it. And so that took a while for us to get to that point where now most of our presenters know that I'm gonna come at them with that. And like just me talking about just weave it into your script. It's so nice if you just like build it in. So for me, it was just bringing, again, that lens to what we're doing. And and then just building it into the workflow for all of us.
And one thing that we did with, so we have a couple of videos that have, they're just narration, but some of them do have soundtracks, and we've taken care to make sure that our soundtracks are, we don't have cannon fire in our audio. It's calm narration with a fairly easy tone, without a lot of volume changes, no explosions, no bright flashes. I think in one case we used a public domain recording. I think it was of a Mozart piano sonata, just very calm music. Again, public domain, so it's zero cost. That provides some background and provides a little bit of ambiance, but without being so loud and overwhelming that it could be disturbing to people who are a little who might be sensitive to loud noises or bright flashes. So just considering that, again, if filtering it through every aspect, including your soundtrack.
I forgot, I'd also like to add about feeling your virtual program as a accessible and inclusive space is just at the beginning, we say to our attendees, we're going to do an access check now. And that's where we talk about our captions and we describe ourselves and how we're going to describe the images. And just doing that in the beginning lets everyone know that this is a space where you can check in with us about accessibility, which I think is just that simple thing can be huge.
Awesome. Well, we have one more question, and we have just a couple minutes left to answer it. So, so this one is ideas for families with Alzheimer's. The Heather, I don't want to even try to say your last name because I know I'm going to mess it up, is wondering if any of us have done any special times to help with like sensory overload or anything like that. I can start with this one. We do a couple times a year, we will typically do what we call a Spark program, which is for people with dementia and Alzheimer's and their care partners. And we do it specifically on a day when we're closed to the public, so that it's not as crowded. We can stay on the one level, you know, we can stay in one space and not be in the way. And those are specialized programs. So we think about when we're writing those scripts, all of the different things that we, how can we draw out those long-term memories? We try to incorporate a lot of tactile, being the Molly Brown House Museum, we of course have the Unsinkable Molly Brown musical that we can use. So one of our programs is all about the music and, trying to get people to think about when they were kids and they might have gone and seen the movie and that kind of thing. So we do specialized times. But.
I'll just answer briefly. We do have not specialized times, we do have specialized programs. We've had a few different kinds over the years. We've had kind of discussion-based ones with storytelling and touch objects and other things. Again, kind of inviting people to maybe have a shared memory or story, or just the opportunity to have kind of a shared experience with someone. And now we actually focus more on some of our arts connections. So they actually hosted tea dances, so daytime dances on Intrepid when it was in service. So we work with an organization that does dances specifically for individuals with dementia and their care partners, and bringing that onto the ship. So it's been really great to make that connection and be able to provide transportation for those as well. And also, one thing I will say is that we do provide training. So even though we don't have special hours, we do work with an organization called Caring Kind, which is local to New York. It's formerly the Alzheimer's Association of New York, but they do trainings for cultural organizations. And there are many different organizations across the country that do this. So I highly recommend seeking out some of that training, not just for yourself, but for others on staff as well, or volunteers if possible, because it does help with that. People feeling prepared. And then honestly, we've had people just happy to have this training because maybe someone in their family was just recently diagnosed or something like that. And so it's also a way of, kind of as a added benefit, sometimes providing a resource for staff that they may not have mentioned that they were seeking out as well.
So I've put up a QR code and a link, and I saw that Sean dropped it into the chat as well. So we compiled a list of some resources that we thought might be helpful to get you or further you on your access journey. So you can find those there. So I'll leave that up for just a second. And then our last slide is just our contact information for anybody who would like to reach out. I know that I'm happy to answer questions, and I think it's safe to say that the rest of us are as well. So feel free to reach out to any one of us if you have questions, if you want to come visit our museums, if you want to see what we're doing in action. We're all more than happy, I think, to do that. So thank you so much for coming and listening, and hopefully you guys learned some stuff, and good luck in your accessibility journeys.